Hello, my name is Dr. Yvonne McFadden. Thank you very much for having me along to the Notes from Home conference. And my paper today is about stories from the Raws, which is based on my current job, which is a research associate on a project about the lost villages of East Ayrshire. So we're looking at miners' rows that no longer exist in the landscape. So we're looking at that, I suppose, now the intangible history, all that's left of these rows are kind of ruins and people's memories. So the talk today, I want to focus on, I suppose I want to make a case for the value of oral history, particularly in histories of home, and also on uncovering women's lives. Mining industry is known as very kind of male-dominated history. The male worker, there's a lot of work on that. But there's not as much work on the kind of the communities and particularly the miners' wives. So that's what I hope to talk about today. I hope you find this interesting. So I'm going to start with some background first, though. If I can turn my slide. Okay. So the mining in Scotland really takes off in the 1840s and 1850s. Like the rest of the UK, the mining companies sunk pits and they built these villages right next to the pits. So you get these kind of insular, quite isolated, often rural communities around the pit heads. Throughout East Ayrshire, as you can see, how many kind of pits and villages and so forth. Basically it's a very rich coalfield area, and there's not as much on it in terms of the historiography. So we're hoping to obviously rectify that. So they built these miners' rows, and that's how they housed the miners. In East Ayrshire as well, it should be said that obviously the companies owned the villages. The two key companies we're looking at is Dunmelton and Co, and they owned our ironworks at Waterside, and then William Baird and Co. Now they merged in 1951, and they control it to become Baird's and Dunmelton, and they're controlling an estimated 70% of the Ayrshire coalfield, so they're quite big players. What we're focused on is this, I suppose, the end of the life of the villages, and our focus is on, what was it like to live in these villages, but also to say, well, what was it like when this community, was dispersed, when you were dislocated? So that's part of what we're looking at as well. So as I say, the company store, the company village, it's a circular economy. So the company is paying the miners' wages. They own the store, they own the beer house. They also control the access roads, and this is something I wasn't aware of until I started doing the oral history, I suppose. So for example, we know that in some villages in Benbot, we have testimony that there was chains across the road to stop any other vans apart from company vans coming up to stock the store or to access, because I don't know if you know, but there was a kind of shops would come up and they would sell things in the villages, and that does happen. But these chains across the road are basically to stop that. For example, the people of Lethen Hill, they actually built a public road by subscription in 1921. And again, that was to combat this kind of gated road. To give you an idea, there's a story in this book, The Hill and Its People, which is based on kind of oral history, or talking to people about the hill. That the watchman would report any children who played in the fields that the company owned, and then if you were reported, the company would then dock your wages. So you get this idea of how captive, I suppose, people were, and the isolation of the community and how dependent they were on the mining company. Despite this, collective remembering about the mining villages is one of happy childhoods that may have been materially poor, but they were community rich. So I want to very briefly talk about the miners' houses, so you get an idea of what kind of houses they were living in. They lived in rows. These rows could be quite short. They could maybe have 10 houses, but one of the rows we're looking at has 99 houses in it, the Common Row near Common Dyke. So you get an idea. We know quite a lot about it because of the Ayrshire Miners' Rows report, and that talks about the conditions that were very poor. And this is written by two mining union officials, and it was part of the Royal Commission on Housing, which reported back in 1917, which was delayed because of the war. They are very scathing in the report of what they see, and they paint a general picture of, they go through it, they're very meticulous as well, and they document, you know, the no running water, poor sanitation, the open sewers. Generally, there are 1 or 2 rooms with scullery in the back. So this is a quote about one of our villages, Burnfoot Hill, and this is a picture of Burnfoot Hill, the Paul Nason Row it's called. And you can see the emphasis is original, so you can see how kind of passionate Brown was about what he saw. But what I want to do is I want to play a short clip to really give you a sense of living in the Rows from one of our interviewees. So this is Sam Purdy. He was born in 1936 and he lived in the village of Glenbuck in the 1940s and 1950s, where he grew up. So I want to play this because I think this sums up, you can say it better than I can basically, and you'll get a real sense of what it was like to live in these rows.
Glenbuck itself was, being so small, it was a complete community. Everybody knew everybody else. First of all, Glenbuck was primitive. There was no electricity, there was no gas, so all cooking was done on the fire. And this huge grate formed the main hub of the living room, because miners lived in rows comprising 2 apartments, and sometimes 10 of a family in these 2 rooms. The Shankleys, for instance, there were 10 of them, and they were in one of these houses, which was 2 apartments. Eventually, they managed to acquire the house next door, so they annexed another 2 rooms. But you can imagine the living conditions. The other thing that was not, water wasn't piped into any of these houses. These houses were built in the mid-19th century by the coal owners. There was no sanitation, there was no water. Sanitation was all outside. There were no flush toilets. The toilets that were built over open middens, and that was the sewage system, which existed until 1954 when we left.
So you can see from Sam's testimony that not a lot has changed in the village of Glenbuck between that 1913 report and when he left the village and was decanted in 1954. So I wanted to play that because I think he basically says it better, and that's the point of this project, is to hear what other people, hear how people experience their housing. Also, I should say the Shankleys is Bill Shankly's family, who came from Glenbuck. I must say that the village has produced a lot of quite famous footballers. Bill Shankly was the manager of Liverpool successfully for many years, and everyone from Glenbuck talks about Shankly. Okay, so I want to talk about water. As you know, these houses didn't have any water, very rarely. Generally, this was collected every day from the pump, which is locally known as the spout or the spigot. That's what people called it, the spout. And it really, like how labour intensive this would really depend on how far away you were. Now, this is testimony from Andrew Sim. This is an autobiography donated to us, and he gives a good idea again. He talks about the 2 inset beds, but he talks about also that they had cold water. This was very unusual. That was because his dad got the cold water supply in, and that saves a lot of energy and a lot of effort. And also, I should say that his dad also used to build WCs out the back for people in their back gardens as well, because his dad was the pit joiner, not pit joiner, apologies. He was a village joiner, which is not the same as a pit joiner. He was employed by the company to try and improve the houses. So he would fix the doors, the windows, things like that. So you get a sense from this where the water was. I want to just add this picture. So when I was up at the site of Lethen Hill, mostly what is left is the toilets. These are toilets that were added later on. These are brick built ones with a concrete roof. So this is the most intact. That was the best toilet in Lethen Hill that I found. But also what littered the ground everywhere was these pails. And so I said to a woman that I was interviewing, I said, "Oh, I've been up." I said, "I saw all these pails lying on the ground." And she said, "Oh, I hope you didn't touch it." Because those pails were used for multiple things, such your clean water, your cooking water, your cleaning water, but also there was a pail that was for doing your business, especially if you had small children. So she was hoping that I didn't touch one of these. And this is just a funny reminiscence again from Sam about Arthur Woodburn, Secretary of State for Scotland coming in, and he talks about the conditions, obviously, and he says, as he leaves, he says, "Where's your toilet, dear?" And she points to the pail in the lobby. So I would wish I could play it because Sam tells you it so wonderfully, but we don't have enough time, I'm afraid. So this job largely fell to the women, with some help from children. And here we have people just reminiscing about what they felt women's lives were like within the mining villages. This one says they'd no life whatsoever. All my memories were of them cooking, washing dirty pit clothes, dyeing them around the fire, and with steaming, of course, because it came very wet sometimes, and having kids. And that's my assumption. So this was the man who was talking to us about growing up in the mining villages, and this is his perception of the women working. And yeah, so that was the thing. So the stories of, the women had to have the water ready for the men coming home from the pit, because they were coming home filthy, and not only their clothes but themselves. So that was a job that a woman had to have ready, the basically hot water. So that was another thing she had to have. And the pit clothes obviously were washed overnight because miners didn't have a lot of clothes, and these would have dried by the fire, and sometimes they'd put them on still wet. But also that brings a hazard home into the house. The coal, the soot, the coal dust, sorry, is coming home with the miners as well. And this one is a woman, she grew up in Lethenhill, and then she also lived in another role later on called Pennyberry, and she was talking about women's life. So I said, what did you get up to? What did the women do? Do you remember what your mum did? And she said, no, there were two busy women working. Their life was a drudge, keeping the house, trying to keep the washing going. Their life was nothing, really. So these give you some ideas and here's another opinion. This is from a woman that we have a tape recording from 1998, and she talks about that as well. But then they had to heat the water, and it was, these women hadn't time to do anything else because they were either carrying water, heating water, or washing them, and cooking and cleaning. So there's this idea that women's life in the hill, not just the hill, on all the villages, was hard work. And that's something that we're getting at from the oral histories, and creating a kind of picture of a woman's life working within these poor conditions. So another aspect of living in the house was the wash houses. So like the tenements of Glasgow, and I'm sure wash houses elsewhere up and down the country, women had a day, and that was your day to use the wash house. It was a lot of work. So quite often you had to go out on your day and light the fire early, because it took a long time to get enough water up the heat to do your washing. And sometimes in a couple of cases we've heard that they've said their dad would go out and do that for their mum. And also it doesn't matter the weather, because that's the thing, we live in Scotland. I don't know if any of you know Scotland well, but it's quite wet, so it's quite hard to get that washing dried as well. And obviously this gives a sense of the chores. This quote from Sam really gives a sense of the chore involved, not only in the washing, but also in carrying the water. So this is a common theme. The theme really that emerges in terms of work is the labour of having water and gathering water and heating water all day, and also this theme of laundry and washing. Here in this picture, you can see the wash houses at Common Dyke, shared among the rows. They've got quite a few wash houses between them all, so you can get a sense, and also you can see the washing hanging out on the line. That must have been a good dry day. This photo was taken from the Bing, actually at Common Dyke, donated by a Rab McMurdo. Lots of people have been very generous, donating lots of pictures. So this woman's work, this is an illustration from Alice Wallace. So she grew up in Ben Watt, the late 1940s and into the 1950s, and she remembers a lot of her mum's memories, because she talked to her and made a point of recording them. And this is from her autobiography, and she talks about this is how women used to clean their big heavy blankets, and they would help each other as well. And it wasn't she's talking about that, the trips of fetching and carrying. And she talks about the labour, but also you can see the two women here in Alice's biography and also her interview. We've also interviewed Alice as well. The real sense of women's support, women's camaraderie, and sharing of work really comes to the fore in her interview and also her book. And it's a real story of how women can form these support networks in quite difficult circumstances, which obviously people do in other contexts as well. So that brings me to the end of my talk. These are just some snippets from the project. We're still in early days of analysis, and we're still collecting oral histories as well. And I think, again, just to say, the story of the mining communities has focused on miners, unions, the decline, the deindustrialisation, and women's experiences can be missing. Although of note is the Women in the Miners' Strike project, which is fantastic. But I want to say that when we focus on home, when we decide to study home, then the work and labour of women is eliminated and it's brought into a focus. The basic communities, the scarcity of resources, mean that mining women had to be very good household managers to keep a family fed and clean and clothed. Elizabeth Roberts, in her seminal oral history of women and family in Northern England, demonstrates the importance of working class women's skills in the domestic arena and how essential this is to maintain family, to keep children healthy and also breadwinners healthy. Likewise, the childhood memories of the mothers within these mining communities, they remember the hard work and the labour that their mothers faced living in these kind of challenging houses. Reflections on women's lives in mining communities are stories about work and burden, but they're also about strong bonds between women of support and of friendship. And after the villages were demolished, many women remained neighbours on the new housing estates, and they maintained those lifelong bonds throughout. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'm looking forward to the panel.